Fred Gross was a young boy when the Nazis invaded his hometown of Antwerp, Belgium. As the Nazis were about to roll into his city, his father Sam was preparing his family to flee before it was too late. They managed to find a cab driver who would take them out of town, and then were able to purchase a vehicle that would take them to southern France before it broke down. In France, a kind farmer allowed them to stay in his barn, which they did, until word came that it was no longer safe for Jews to be in the region. Fred and his family were able to join a Red Cross convoy that brought his family to a Pyrenees village, where they stayed for a time before ultimately being rounded up by French police and taken to the Gurs concentration camp. After 10 days in the camp, Fred and his family managed to escape and make their way to a nearby village, where villagers protected them and helped them get to Nice, which at the time was under Italian control. For every survivor, there is a story that tells of harrowing and an improbable escape from certain death. Today I point to Fred's story, not because of what happened to him in Europe, but because of what happened to him when he got to America. The Gross family was granted permission to leave Europe and enter the United States, which they did by boat that brought them to Norfolk, Virginia. Upon arrival at the port, Fred left his parents and ran into the bathroom. A few minutes later, Fred's parents were horrified to see that Fred was being escorted from the facilities by an angry-looking policeman. Fred's mother's first thought was that here too it wasn't safe to be a Jew. Here too, our family is not safe. After Fred pointed his parents out to the policeman, he was escorted over to them, and he remembered the policeman saying to his parents, "I found your boy in the colored bathroom. Teach this kid how white children are supposed to behave." For Fred and his family, the continent was different, the rules were adjusted, but the guiding principle of society was the same. There are those on top and those on bottom, those who wield power and those who are vulnerable to their rulers. When the corona outbreak first reached our shores, I would have thought that differences between people would have cooled. We were now faced with a life-threatening challenge that was no longer an Italian problem, a Chinese problem, a Brazilian problem. It was a human problem. I did not foresee that a perfect storm would erupt here in America that not only failed in uniting us, it intensified the divisions among us. Access to health care varied based on socioeconomic status. Death rates soared in certain communities, while others fared way better. And then came the murder of George Floyd. And what started out as a battle against a virus morphed into a battle for the soul of our country. Shortly after World War II, the French author and philosopher Albert Camus wrote his classic, The Plague, because he wanted to take a look back at the toll that the Great War took on humanity. He looked at how people responded to a plague, just like how now we can step back and contemplate how we have responded to our own plague. In Camus' depiction, the plot is set in a French Algerian village known as Oran, where a virus carried by rats infects mass numbers of the population. In the beginning of the book, when dead rats become ubiquitous all over town, a luxury hotel maitre d' laments to a friend that dead rats just appeared in his hotel lobby. The friend responds that he shouldn't be alarmed. The same thing's happening to everyone. To which the maitre d' responds, yes, but the luxury is supposed to separate us from the masses. Now we have been reduced to the level of the common man. This corona age that we are living in has brought with it a stark reminder of inequality in our society, which then exploded following the horrific murder of George Floyd. With most of the country quarantined and glued to their TVs, what unfolded has led to a new and seminal moment in the ongoing battle for human dignity and equality. Today, as we are beset by a devastating pandemic, We have been awakened to a revolution that demands justice be restored to those who have been persecuted and disenfranchised for 400 years here in this land where it was once proclaimed that all men are created equal. This isn't the first time we've heard this plea. It's not the first time we've been told that we're not living up to the principles our nation was supposed to be founded on. It's not the first time we've been told that we are not doing our part. In the final Sunday sermon of his life, Dr. Martin Luther King ascended the podium in Washington's National Cathedral and opened his words by recounting, of all things, the short story of Rip Van Winkle from the pen of Washington Irving. Dr. King explained how in the story a Dutch-American villager ends up falling asleep in the Catskill Mountains for 20 years. At the moment he descended into his deep slumber, posters of the King of England reminded all the colonists whose power held sway in their land. Yet when Rip awakes after 2 decades, he sees that the posters of George Washington had replaced posters of the king. A new government was in place, as was a new law of the land. Rip had slept through the revolution and missed the entire War of Independence. On March 31st, 1968, 4 days before he was assassinated, Martin Luther King pointed to the civil rights movement, the movement of his people, the movement for all people who believed that the words on the Declaration of Independence could one day be achieved. And he implored his listeners not to sleep through the revolution. This age that we are living in has been a wake-up call for me, as it has for many in our country. I find it fortunate that over the past year, I became very interested in understanding the suffering of others and how a Jew specifically relates to such suffering. My interest in this topic preceded the age of Corona and was well before the world ever heard the name George Floyd. I became interested in these ideas because of a lecture I attended at the URJ Biennial on lessons gleaned from the teaching of Professor Elie Wiesel, a lecture that was offered by a brilliant scholar and former teaching assistant of Wiesel's at Boston University. Those who have taken my various classes over the past year likely heard me refer to Elie Wiesel's philosophy from time to time as I continue to delve deeper and deeper into understanding how he perceived the world. What I learned was what truly separated him from other Holocaust survivors. While they all have powerful stories to tell, what Elie Wiesel taught us was unique. Because he suffered, he would say, I don't want others to suffer. Others, meaning other human beings. That's why it was significant when he, as a Holocaust survivor, went to places like Sudan and the former Yugoslavia. Because he knew firsthand how people were suffering there, he committed himself to doing what he could to put an end to it. Learning this lesson from the genius of Elie Wiesel was important for me, as someone who has always seen his job first and foremost as standing up for the Jewish people. It reminded me that beyond standing up as a Jew is living as a Jew, which means that we are required to act until justice is proclaimed throughout every inch of our land. Martin Luther King recognized this dictum of the Jewish faith. He appreciated it and respected it. And before his famous I Have a Dream speech, he invited Rabbi Joachim Prinz, formerly of Berlin, to address the crowd immediately before his iconic speech. Rabbi Prinz ascended to the podium and told the massive crowd, "When I was the rabbi of the Jewish community in Berlin, under the Hitler regime, I learned many things. The most important thing that I learned under those tragic circumstances was that bigotry and hatred are not the most urgent problem. The most urgent, the most disgraceful, the most shameful and most tragic problem is silence. A great people, which had created a great civilization, had become a nation of silent onlookers. They remained silent in the face of hate, in the face of brutality, and in the face of mass murder. Thinkers like Rabbi Prince and Professor Wiesel could have been forgiven for spending their post-Holocaust lives waging war against anti-Semitism, informing the world what happens when this particular hatred goes unchecked. But each had greater aspirations in working to end suffering in this world. And their approach was thoroughly in line with our tradition. In the Talmud, in a tractate called Sota, there is a discussion about the danger of a society that permits poverty and suffering to run rampant. Our ancient sages warned the elite of society were not permitted to allow any segment of the population to descend into poverty, because it would lead to crime, murder, and the corrosion of values that would affect the whole society. The medieval sage Rashi specifically points to poverty as the factor that sets off a society's downfall. And the Talmud even goes so far as to say that when such conditions are allowed to exist, then the mechanisms that the divine has given us to preserve the holiness of society can no longer function. In other words, when a society allows segments of its population to wallow in misery of any kind, the ramifications will include the distancing of God's presence from that society. The truth is that here in the United States, my family, your family, our families have been given the opportunity to succeed. There have no doubt been challenges, quotas, anti-Semitism, places we couldn't eat or lodge or play golf, but nothing compared to the black community. For 400 years, while they're suffering more from slavery to Jim Crow to crushing poverty and abusive political policy to mass incarceration, the Jewish community saw an end to quotas, invitations to join the social elite, and the normalization of the Jew as a member of America's first-class family. It is true. We can hearken back to the suffering of our ancestors and ask, if we could rise above it, why can't other minorities? But in this country, where race and not religion is the dominant indicator in our artificial and corrupt caste system, we have been able to achieve while others have had their growth stunted at every turn. The murder of George Floyd in many ways woke up our country from a deep slumber. Corona gave us the time to reflect on what we've been missing. The awakening that is taking place now in America has made it fashionable, finally, to listen closely to what anthropologists and sociologists have long been trying to explain to us. According to a report that appeared in the Washington Post this past June, the percentage of black children living below the poverty line is 3 times that of whites. The net worth of white households is now 10 times greater than black households. Schools in mainly white neighborhoods receive $2,200 more per student than non-white schools in the school year. Blacks are killed by the police at more than twice the rate of whites. Out of every 100,000 people incarcerated, 2,306 are black, 450 are white. The problems are endless, and the statistics are real. And so I believe when George Floyd died, and the United States collectively paused and said, this is unacceptable, the Jewish community, in large part, were one of the first groups to rise up and say, we too demand equality. This isn't surprising. The image of Abraham Joshua Heschel marching arm in arm with Dr. King is emblazoned on the American Jewish consciousness as a symbol of our solidarity with those who fight for racial and social justice in this country. Unfortunately today, as the protests endure and the marchers continue in the streets, there is no Dr. King leading the way. There's no central movement among America's black community that is organized and accountable with a representational hierarchy that we can communicate with. What there is a movement that's been effective and stirring America's conscience, that has caused us to look deeply inside the soul of our nation, that has galvanized the masses to demand change, to restore justice, and to once and for all admit that the racist components of America's society must finally be eradicated. This movement has come to be known by a very simple yet profound phrase: Black Lives Matter. These were the words written in huge letters on streets in Washington and New York City. This is the new name of the street where tear gas was fired at protesters not far from the White House. I understand the phrase. I understand that while all lives matter, for too long America has acted as if black lives don't matter. The statistics are too clear to dispute it. And so the natural tendency for the Jew is to stand up and say, I agree that black lives matter, and I will march with them, until, as Dr. King once said, the arc of the universe finally bends and breaks towards justice. But yet, even now, when the Jewish heart is moved and prepared to take action, even today as we hear the call that we have not done enough to eliminate the policies and attitudes that hold our black brothers and sisters down, even now when we are willing to admit that the Jew has risen more swiftly than the African American community through the ranks of American hierarchy, when we extend our hand to help, while some reach for it and thank us for our support, there are others saying, yes, even here, we do not want you Jews standing next to us. We don't want the stench of Zionism that oppresses the Palestinians like white America oppresses blacks marching next to us. We don't want to see your Stars of David. We're not interested in your help. You are part of the problem. You are who we are marching against. Unfortunately, this component of the movement grabs a lot of headlines, and deservedly so. They have recruited celebrities into their ranks, which results in social media postings denigrating Jews and leaving us feeling like the leadership of the movement harbors ill will towards the Jewish community. Not long ago, I saw that a friend of mine from college, an African American, had posted images from a Black Lives Matter rally in New York City. I wrote to her and asked her, did you happen to see any anti-Israel or any anti-Semitic signs, or hear anyone at all denigrating the Jewish people at the rally? She responded that she had been to dozens of rallies and never once came across this. Literally within moments after reading her response, as if by divine intervention, I turned on the news where images of protests in Portland were being aired. I looked casually at the TV, and literally the first thing I saw in Portland, Oregon, was a sign denouncing the IDF as white oppressors. Maybe I'm a bit more sensitive than my friend to anti-Israel bashing, but this is the truth. The majority of the Black Lives Matter supporters do not display any anti-Semitic behavior, but they don't denounce with any real force the anti-Semitic minority that has joined their ranks. In his important book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, Ibram Kendi explains that a behavioral racist is one who makes individuals responsible for the perceived behavior of racial groups and makes racial groups responsible for the behavior of the individuals. I hear what he's saying, and I would not say that everyone in the Black Lives Matter movement is anti-Semitic. I'm not a behavioral racist. But I do say, if their movement wants Jews to march alongside of them to achieve racial justice we all yearn for, how do they expect us to do it when they do not work to stamp out the hate mongers among them who hate us? Today, as we open this season of repentance, I would like to say before our Creator that I have not done enough to help our black brothers and sisters. I, for too long, have enjoyed the fruits of freedom that this country offers me and denies others. I will not sleep through this revolution, nor will I allow others to fall asleep on my watch. But I will not step over my own people to do it. Yes, I will begin now on embarking on ways to fix the justice system. But no, I will not deny the justice the Jewish community deserves as well. Yes, I will work with our interfaith friends to build coalitions of strength that seek restorative justice for those who have been held down. But no, I will not forget my role as a rabbi and defender of the Jewish people in the process. Yes, I will communicate to Jewish business leaders, lawyers, court officials, politicians, employers, that they must effect real change in their spheres of influence to level the playing field for all races. But no, I will not ask them to sacrifice their pride of Jewish identity in the process. Yes, I will march with anyone who truly seeks peace and justice for all people and wishes to see America finally live up to its divinely inspired promise that freedom be proclaimed throughout all of our land. But no, I will not join hands with those who will not denounce anyone and everyone who falsely blames my people or our spiritual homeland for their struggle. When Menachem Begin was Prime Minister of Israel, he was often threatened by more powerful nations to make concessions that he felt threatened the security of the state of Israel. After one such threat, he famously retorted, "I am not a Jew with trembling knees." In his comment, he indicated that for far too long, Jews have been seen as weak and unwilling to stand up for themselves. After all that Begin had been through, he had the gravitas and the gumption to say before the world's strongest powers that he was not someone that could be pushed around. I, too, am not a Jew with trembling knees, but like Begin, I am a Jew. And a Jew must know that when anyone suffers, we all suffer, that wherever we can alleviate pain, we must. We've been in those shoes. And now we must lift up others who walk the path that our people have known far too well and for far too long. At this moment, as revolution wears on, our knees cannot tremble, nor can our ears ignore the call of our prophet Amos, who taught us to let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. Amen.